Welcome back to Echo Mind Documentaries. If this is your first time here, subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. What happens to life when it is completely alone for millions of years? Not thousands, millions. The answer exists right now, on this planet, in places most people will never see and science has barely begun to understand. This planet is older than almost anything the human mind can hold. 4.5 billion years, long enough for continents to split apart and collide again, long enough for oceans to appear, evaporate, and refill, long enough for life to emerge from chemistry, spread across every surface, dive into every depth, and then, in the places most cut off from everything else, begin again entirely on its own. We tend to think of nature as connected, a web, a system where species interact, compete, migrate, and blend. And across most of the planet, that is true. But there are corners of this Earth where that web was severed by ocean, by altitude, by absolute darkness, by time so vast it erased the original connection entirely. In those places, life did not simply adapt, it reinvented itself. And what it became in the silence of isolation is unlike anything found anywhere else on Earth. This is the story of those places, the ecosystems that evolved alone, the creatures that exist nowhere else on Earth, and the question that hangs over all of it. How much of this extraordinary, irreplaceable world do we still have time to understand before it is gone? We begin where the story of evolution itself was forced into clarity. The Galapagos Islands rise from the Pacific Ocean nearly 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. There is no land bridge, there never was. The islands themselves are volcanic, born from a hot spot in the ocean floor, pushed upward through the water over millions of years. When they emerged, they were empty, bare rock, no soil, no species, nothing. And then, slowly, life arrived. Not by invitation, by accident. Birds blown off course by storms, insects carried on wind currents from South America, reptiles riding rafts of floating vegetation across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean. Each arrival was an act of almost impossible chance, and each one that survived found something extraordinary waiting for it on the other side of that crossing. A world with no predators, no competitors, no established order, just volcanic rock, ocean wind, and time. The animals that colonized the Galapagos did not stay the same, with no pressure from outside species, with each island offering a slightly different environment, food source, or terrain. Populations began to diverge. A single ancestor became many descendants, each fitted to the specific conditions of the island it landed on. The finches Charles Darwin observed there are the most famous example. A single ancestral species, arriving from the mainland millions of years before Darwin's ship anchored in the harbor, eventually became 13 distinct species, each with a different beak, each exploiting a different food source, some cracking seeds, some probing flowers. One, the woodpecker finch, using cactus spines as tools to extract insects from bark, a behavior seen in almost no other bird species on Earth. But the finches are only the beginning. The marine iguana of the Galapagos is the only ocean-going lizard in the world. Its ancestors were land iguanas, likely arrived from South America on floating debris. They found the islands rich in one food source that nothing else was using: algae, growing thick along the submerged lava shelves just offshore. The problem was getting to it. Over thousands of generations, the iguana learned to dive. Its body adapted, the snout flattened to graze more efficiently along rock surfaces underwater, the claws lengthened and curved to grip against ocean surge. The body learned to cool dramatically during a dive, slowing the heart to conserve oxygen, then warm again in the sun on the surface. Behaviors and physiological adaptations found in no other lizard anywhere on the planet. This is what isolation produces when given enough time. Not just variation, invention. The giant tortoises of the Galapagos represent perhaps the most striking example of island gigantism recorded in science. Their ancestors were small tortoises from the South American mainland. On islands with no predators and abundant vegetation, there was no advantage to staying small. Size became beneficial. The largest individuals survived longer, reproduced more, and over millennia, the species became enormous. Some live for over 170 years. Some weigh more than 400 kilograms. They move through the landscape like slow, ancient thinking, and they are the last survivors of a lineage that isolation turned into something the mainland never produced. Now, travel north, across the Pacific, across the Asian continent, deep into Siberia. There, in a rift valley carved by tectonic forces over 25 million years, sits a body of water unlike any other on the planet, Lake Baikal. It holds more fresh water than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. It reaches a depth of over 1,600 meters, the deepest lake on Earth. And it has been here, largely sealed from the outside world by its geography and its age, for longer than most mountain ranges have existed. The result is an ecosystem of extraordinary isolation and complexity. Nearly 2,500 species live in Lake Baikal. More than 80% of them are found nowhere else on Earth. This is not a lake, it is a biological archive, sealed in ice for 5 months of every year, hiding an interior world that evolved almost entirely on its own. The Baikal seal, the Nerpa, is the only exclusively freshwater seal species on the planet. Its ancestors were ringed seals, likely migrated from the Arctic Ocean millions of years ago through ancient river systems that no longer exist. When those connections closed, the seals were trapped, and in that trapping, they became something new. Smaller than their ocean relatives, more agile in fresh water, capable of diving to 400 meters in search of the endemic fish species that make up their diet. They breathe through holes in the winter ice, scratching them open with reinforced claws, behavior adapted to a world of sealed, frozen water, a world their ancestors never knew. The deepest regions of the lake contain life that survives under conditions of zero light and near freezing temperatures sustained over millions of years. Sponges that filter bacteria from water columns stretching hundreds of meters. Flatworms that exist in the sediment and have been doing so since before the ice ages. Tiny crustaceans called amphipods that have diversified into over 350 species within a single lake, filling every ecological niche available to them. The diversity within Baikal rivals that of entire ocean regions, in a lake in Siberia, sealed from the world. Cross the continent west, descend through the Middle East into the Arabian Sea. There is an island there that the world largely forgot, Socotra. It sits in the Gulf of Aden, geographically closer to Africa than to Arabia, isolated by deep ocean channels that have kept it separated from both continents for somewhere between 6 and 20 million years. It is approximately the size of the state of Rhode Island, and it contains one of the most botanically alien landscapes on the surface of this planet. A third of the plant species found on Socotra exist nowhere else on the world. Nowhere. Not a related species, not a subspecies. The exact plant, the exact lineage, found only here. 30 million years of uninterrupted evolution produced a flora so distinctive that botanists arriving for the first time described the feeling as landing on another planet. The dragonblood tree is the island's most iconic symbol. It grows with a canopy so wide and so flat it looks architectural, a living umbrella, designed by evolutionary pressure to capture moisture from the island's seasonal fog rather than waiting for rain. Its trunk stores water, its roots spread wide and shallow, and when its bark is cut, it bleeds a deep red resin that has been harvested by the island's people for thousands of years, used in medicine, dye, and ritual. The tree is ancient. Its genus, Dracaena, traces back to a time when the supercontinent Gondwana was still intact. Socotra's isolation preserved a living fragment of a world that no longer exists anywhere else. But the dragonblood trees are not regenerating. The seedlings are dying. Changing rainfall patterns, driven by shifting climate systems, are drying out the fog belt that the trees depend on.
The adult trees standing now are largely the last generation. When they fall, they will not be replaced, and 30 million years of isolation will end not with a discovery, but with a silence. Go deeper now. Below the surface of every ocean, past the point where sunlight penetrates, past the twilight zone where bioluminescent creatures ghost through the dark, down to the places where pressure becomes a force most materials cannot withstand. There is a world that runs on entirely different rules. The hydrothermal vent ecosystems of the deep ocean were discovered in 1977 by a submersible expedition along the Galapagos rift on the ocean floor. What the scientists aboard found shattered one of the most fundamental assumptions in biology. Life did not require sunlight. Superheated water forced up through cracks in the ocean floor at temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius carries dissolved minerals from deep inside the Earth. As it meets the near-freezing ocean water above, those minerals precipitate into towering chimneys of sulfide compounds, some rising 20 meters from the seafloor. And around those chimneys, in absolute darkness, under pressure that would crush a human body, entire ecosystems thrive. The foundation of these ecosystems is not photosynthesis, it is chemosynthesis. Bacteria that convert hydrogen sulfide and other compounds released from the vents into organic matter. Energy from chemistry rather than light. A metabolic process so different from the rest of life on Earth that it opened an entirely new chapter in the understanding of what life requires to exist. Built on those bacteria, entire food webs assembled themselves in the dark. Tube worms grow to over 2 meters in length, anchored to the vent chimneys with no mouth and no digestive system. Instead, they host chemosynthetic bacteria internally, absorbing nutrients directly from the microbes living within them. They have no parallel in the sunlit world. They are something evolution only arrived at in absolute isolation from the rest of life's solutions. Giant white clams, shrimp with no conventional eyes, but with photoreceptors along their backs, sensitive to the faint thermal glow of the vents themselves. Predatory fish so adapted to darkness and pressure that they cannot survive at the surface. Ghostly crabs that pick through the mineral chimneys with precise, deliberate movements in a world where no light has ever reached. Each vent is an island, separated from other vents by hundreds of kilometers of bare ocean floor. Species colonize them, diversify, and sometimes go extinct when a vent shuts down, only for a new population to find the next active site and begin again. These are among the most isolated ecosystems on the planet, and among the least understood.
Scientists estimate that the deep ocean floor, which covers more than half the surface of the Earth, has been explored in detail less thoroughly than the surface of Mars. The species cataloged from hydrothermal vents represent a fraction of what almost certainly lives there. In the darkness below where human instruments have reached, life almost certainly continues, specialized beyond our current ability to imagine. Surface now. Come back into the light, into a desert so dry it redefines what the word means. The Atacama lies along the Pacific coast of South America, pressed between the Andes Mountains to the east and the cold Humboldt Current to the west. This combination creates a rain shadow so extreme that some weather stations in the Atacama have never recorded measurable rainfall in their entire operational history. It is the driest non-polar desert on Earth, and it is not lifeless. Fog rolls in from the Pacific on certain mornings, a phenomenon the locals call the Camanchaca. It is thin, it disappears within hours. But life in the Atacama has been engineering around exactly this resource for millions of years. Microbes in the soil surface have developed crusts that absorb atmospheric moisture before it evaporates. Certain cacti are spaced across the landscape at intervals so consistent and so precise that it initially appears deliberate, as if planted by hand. The spacing is the result of root competition for moisture. Each plant claims a territory of soil large enough to sustain it. Any seedling that germinates too close dies before it can establish itself.
The pattern you see across the desert floor is survival mapped in botanical geometry. Lichen grow on the underside of translucent quartz pebbles across certain Atacama plains. The stone acts as a diffuser, letting just enough light through for photosynthesis while protecting the organism below from desiccation. Life using rock as a greenhouse, a solution so specific to this environment that nothing like it occurs anywhere else on Earth. And in the hyper-arid core of the Atacama, where even these adaptations reach their limits, researchers have found microbial life surviving in conditions previously considered incompatible with biology. In soil with almost no water activity, in salt deposits where humidity is measured not in percentages but in fractions of percentages, in conditions closer to the surface of Mars than anywhere else on Earth. This is why the Atacama is studied by astrobiologists, not as a metaphor for other worlds, as a direct analog. If life can persist here, in this, then the question of where else in the universe it might persist opens considerably. Return now to the forest, to the largest, densest, most biologically complex terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. The Amazon basin covers over 7 million square kilometers. It contains an estimated 10% of all species on Earth, and within it, isolation operates not across ocean channels or mountain ranges, but across something as narrow as a river. The great rivers of the Amazon act as biological barriers. Populations on opposite banks of the same river, separated by nothing more than a few hundred meters of moving water, diverge over thousands of generations into distinct species: birds, primates, amphibians, reptiles. The river is uncrossable to them not because of distance, but because of exposure. An animal adapted to dense forest canopy does not cross open water. The result is a mosaic of micro-isolations nested inside the larger isolation of the forest itself. Scientists have documented bird species whose entire global range is a single ridge in the Amazon. Remove the ridge, log the specific patch of forest it supports, and the species vanishes permanently. There is no backup population, no alternative habitat, no members of that species anywhere else waiting to repopulate. This is endemism at its most extreme. Life so finely fitted to one specific place that it cannot exist in any other configuration of the world. The Amazon is not one ecosystem, it is thousands. Each river bend, each patch of seasonally flooded forest, each vertical layer from root system to upper canopy harbors life that has been shaped by the specific conditions of that exact location over spans of time that resist easy comprehension. We have named perhaps a quarter of the species that live there. The rest remain unknown. Some will go extinct before we find them. Go underground now. In 1986 in Romania, researchers drilling near the Black Sea discovered something no one expected: a cave system sealed from the outside world for approximately 5.5 million years, the Movile Cave. No light had entered it, no surface water, no outside organic material. It was completely cut off from the world above for longer than the genus Homo has existed on Earth. And inside it, 48 species were discovered that exist nowhere else: spiders, centipedes, water scorpions, leeches, isopods. All evolved in complete darkness, in an atmosphere high in carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, fed by chemosynthetic bacteria growing on the surface of the cave's thermal waters. Eyes had become vestigial or disappeared entirely in many of the species, replaced by enhanced tactile and chemical sensory systems. Pigmentation was gone. Color serves no purpose in absolute darkness, and the energy required to produce it is expensive in an ecosystem with limited resources. Bodies had elongated, expenditures had extended for navigating through touch in a lightless world. 5.5 million years of isolation had not broken these animals. It had refined them into something extraordinarily fitted to their world. When scientists entered the cave, they were the first living things from the surface to encounter these species. The animals had been there, reproducing, adapting, persisting, in perfect silence for longer than modern humans have been a species.
They were doing fine. There is a question underneath all of this that science is only beginning to ask seriously.
If life can survive, diversify, and thrive in complete isolation across millions of years, in absolute darkness, under crushing pressure, in near waterless rock, in cave systems sealed from sunlight, then what does isolation actually mean for the boundaries of life itself? The answer changes our understanding not just of this planet, but of every planet. Of every moon with a liquid ocean beneath its ice, of every rocky body in the universe with enough chemical energy to sustain a metabolic process somewhere in its interior. The isolated ecosystems of Earth are not just biological curiosities, they are existence proofs, evidence that life, once it takes hold, is far more persistent, far more inventive, and far more difficult to extinguish than we have historically assumed. But they are also extraordinarily fragile in one specific sense. They evolved in the absence of outside pressure. The creatures of the Galapagos had no fear response when humans first arrived because they had never needed one. They had never been hunted. They did not know what a predator was. The blue-footed boobies stood and watched as sailors walked toward them. The giant tortoises approached the ships out of curiosity. Millions of years of perfected adaptation to their island world contained one catastrophic blind spot. They had never learned to run. Invasive species introduced into isolated ecosystems do not encounter resistance. The defensive behaviors, the immune responses, the competitive strategies that ecosystems build up between species that evolve together simply do not exist. A rat introduced to an island where birds have nested on the ground for millions of years does not face a bird that has ever needed to protect a ground nest. The result is a collapse that happens faster than evolution can answer. The ecosystems that took the longest to build are often the first to break. We are living in the middle of the largest disruption to isolated ecosystems in the history of this planet.
Not the largest extinction event. Those have happened before, driven by asteroid impact, volcanic episodes, and glaciation. What makes this moment different is the speed and the mechanism. Species introduced where they do not belong, temperatures rising faster than adaptation timescales, habitats reduced below the minimal size needed to sustain the populations that evolved within them. The dragon blood trees of Socotra are not regenerating. The unique fish of Lake Baikal are under pressure from pollution and warming. The Galapagos, despite being a protected reserve, faces ongoing threats from introduced species, plastic waste, and fishing pressure on the marine ecosystem surrounding it. The deep ocean vents are being studied for mineral extraction before we have cataloged a fraction of what lives there. We are making permanent decisions about places we do not yet understand, about species we have not yet found, about ecosystems that required millions of years to produce what they are. A scientist working in the Atacama once described the feeling of finding living microbes in the driest soil on Earth, not as excitement, but a kind of vertigo. The realization that life is not where you expected, that it has been quietly existing in conditions you would have called impossible, rearranges something fundamental in how you see the world. That vertigo is what all of these places produce when you look at them honestly. The Mobile Cave sealed for 5.5 million years, the hydrothermal vents running food webs in absolute darkness 2 kilometers below the ocean surface, the dragon blood trees bleeding red on an island most maps barely show, the freshwater seal evolving in Siberia from an ancestor that swam in an ocean that no longer exists, the Amazon bird whose entire world is a single ridge in a forest the size of a continent. These are not footnotes in the story of life on Earth. They are the chapters that remind us how little of the story we have actually read. Every isolated ecosystem that disappears takes with it evolutionary knowledge accumulated over timescales that make human history look like a single afternoon. Chemical compounds that exist in no laboratory, genetic sequences that solved biological problems in ways we have not yet conceived,
ecological relationships so precise and so ancient that no model can reconstruct them once they are severed. We are erasing archives we have not yet learned to read. And the deepest cost of that erasure is not the loss of what we know, it is the permanent foreclosure of what we could have known, the questions that will never be answerable, the medicines that will never be discovered, the biological solutions to survival that evolution spent millions of years perfecting and that we will never get to see. These places asked nothing from the rest of the world except to be left alone. That was the only condition that made them what they are. Isolation was not their weakness, it was the source of everything extraordinary about them. The condition that allowed evolution to run its most radical experiments, to produce its most improbable results, to build the living archives that now tell us what life is actually capable of when it is left to work without interruption across deep time. The question before us is not whether we find these places beautiful, though they are, not whether we find them scientifically interesting, though they are beyond measure. The question is whether we are willing to hold that kind of patience, to recognize that some things took longer to build than we can comprehend, and that the only appropriate response to that is restraint. The most isolated ecosystems on Earth survived ice ages, they survived mass extinctions, they survived the slow violence of tectonic time. What they are struggling to survive is us, and whether they do will say something permanent about what kind of presence we chose to be on this planet, whether we were the species that arrived and learned, or the one that arrived and erased. The answer is still being written, but not for long.